The second part of the safety stand-down presentation for this month is an emergency checklist refresher. My hope is to remind you of some of the items in the emergency checklist that you may not have looked at in quite a while, to review the memory items for each of the emergency checklists, and to get you thinking about your own self-imposed program for emergency procedures recurrent training. More specifically, we'll be looking at the following checklists: engine failure, wing fire, vacuum failure, alternator overvolt, discharging alternator, and engine fire during start emergency procedures. So the scenario here is you're 8 miles out from Greenville Airport and you are off to the southwest. You were at 5,500 feet when you had an engine failure. This engine failure is not insidious or difficult to detect because things get real quiet real fast. What may be insidious, however, is the approaching engine failure, and may depend upon how often you are scanning the various engine gauges. In any event, the engine is quit. You're descending through 5,000 feet, still on a northeast heading, 8 miles from Greenville. You're at 5,000 feet. What's the first thing that you do? Well, most pilots from a training standpoint are trained to think of A, B, C, D. A meaning airspeed, and that airspeed is the best glide speed. Best glide speed ensures the greatest horizontal distance over the ground, and any slower or any faster shortens that glide distance. Next is B, or best field. Ideally, we've been paying attention to suitable off-field or off-airport landing sites as we go, and this is the time to reaffirm and confirm which landing sites you are likely able to glide to. Typically, a safe estimation, a 45-degree angle down from the horizon represents the area on the surface that you would be able to glide to from your current position. The other thing to consider in selecting that best field and whether or not you have the distance is to know what the glide ratio is. And in general, you can start with the height above ground level. So at 5,000 feet, we're about 4,000 feet above ground level. And in general, you can take 1.5 times that height above ground to find your horizontal glide distance. So 4 times 1.5 would be 6 miles. So 6 miles would be a safe estimate of the distance that you would be able to glide to. We're 8 miles out from Greenville and might not make it. You of course always want to pay attention to airports that may be very close nearby. And you'll note, looking on the GPS, that we have Lowell off to our right at approximately 6 miles. And there are a private hit field right behind us and another one off to our left. Every time you're in the aircraft, you should familiarize yourself with the GPS's nearest button, how to select the various information and airports that are closest to the aircraft, and so next time you're in the aircraft, familiarize yourself with that button's function. Next on the checklist would be C, which, depending on the pilot, represents controls. It may represent carb heat, it may represent check gauges, and it probably should represent all three. You want to put that mixture full rich, you want to go to full throttle, apply carburetor heat, especially if you had suspicion that the engine loss of power was due to carburetor icing. Check the position of the magneto switches, check the fuel selector, check your gauges, and try to troubleshoot. And then finally, D would stand for declare, and that would be squawking 7700, getting on 121.5 if you weren't already in contact with air traffic control, announcing your emergency, your location, souls on board, and where you think you're going to try to be landing. One good reason to always have flight following with air traffic control is if you do develop an emergency, they're immediately right there to help. Although their response would probably be fairly quick, announcing on guard, it would be a much faster and effective service if you already were in contact with air traffic control. With regard to the checklist, if you have enough altitude, you'd want to consider restart procedures. Again, best glide speed here to restart is 75 knots. That's not your best glide speed. That's a better speed to keep the propeller windmilling for restart procedure. Carburetor heat on, again, especially in the instance that there was potential carburetor icing, and fuel selector to both. Those are your memory items. The other ones we discussed as well, the mixture and the mags. And to also be sure that the primer is in and locked. If it's not in and locked, sometimes that can drift out, fuel can leak in, and you can make the mixture overly rich. If the engine is not going to restart and you will have a forced off-airport landing, you establish best glide speed of 70 knots with the flaps up. And the remainder of the checklist is preparing the cabin to minimize the risk of fire and to help ensure an effective emergency egress. So mixture off, fuel off, ignition off, leave the master switch on until you set your flaps. Then the master switch off. The other item you can do is unlatch the doors, which means opening the doors, closing the lock without closing the door, and that prevents it from relatching. That helps ensure that if the fuselage gets deformed, that the door doesn't get jammed shut. And it should be emphasized that touching down in controlled flight is much safer than stalling the aircraft and coming straight down. The greater the distance you can decelerate the aircraft, the greater the survival and the less risk of injury. Next scenario, you're headed southwest. You're about 10 miles northeast of Sparta Airport, 3,500 feet, when you start to smell electrical smoke. What should you do? Well, you're going to want to know those 4 memory items. Master switch off. If you happen to turn the mags off, that's okay. The engine still keeps running, but you can leave the mags on, but you want to turn the master switch off, followed by turning off all other switches. In our aircraft, the master switch is adequate. There's no other electrical circuitry active other than a very small current going to the clock. The third item is to close the vents to choke off the oxygen supply for that fire. That includes the vents overhead as well as the vent or heat control knob on the panel. And then finally activate the fire extinguisher. Following activation of the fire extinguisher, you do have to ventilate the cabin. Once you're sure you have the fire secured, you can then decide whether or not it's safe to reactivate some electrical items. Checking the electrical circuit breakers before turning on the master switch might be a better option just to decide how severe the problem is. However, the checklist does say master switch on, then checking for the faulty circuit breakers, and then deciding what other electrical appliances to reactivate. You should note here that if you turned the master switch off, you should also turn off the avionics switch as well as turn off all of the individual electronic items as well, so that you can turn things on one by one and try to isolate where the faulty circuit lay.